Hello everyone, welcome back to Let's Play The Guardian Legend. In the last part, we went through a majority of Area 1, as well as all of Area 2, and now we're gonna just rock through Area 3, and I think even Area 4 in pretty quick sequence. Largely, the areas in this game move at such a fast pace and are small enough that I can get through about 2 per video on average. Though I think later on there might be some videos that are 1 area long, because the areas do get a little longer as you get into the game, either because they're just generally larger, or especially because sometimes the corridors just get very long in comparison to the early game ones. Speaking of corridors, since now we're in Area 3, the theme has shifted from being underwater to green. I guess it could be a jungle, it could be foresty, either way. Things to look out for in these particular corridors come down to flower enemies that spew out a lot of projectiles, meteorites, but we've been seeing those since Corridor 0, effectively. If there's one thing that is really dangerous, though, there's going to be these red pod plant enemies coming up that when you shoot them, I think even if they are on screen for long enough, they explode into a bunch of pods that home in on you. And it can be pretty hard to take those down unless you have a powered-up blaster that's wider like the one we currently have with our current chip count. Although things like the bullet shield can help mitigate that completely. These blue circles, by the way, they are technically enemies, and you can kill them. There's basically nothing in a shoot-'em-up section you can't destroy. But they have such ridiculously high HP for this point in the game that you're not going to be likely able to kill them without spamming fireballs at them from the moment they're on screen, so it's not worth trying to fight them. With that said, whenever you see a circle of meteorites, that's actually a very good sign for you, because for one thing, you're very likely to get a drop from them, be it chip or health to begin with. But also, that's just good for your score to help you get more health, potentially. A power-up I actually haven't technically talked about yet is... we've seen it around a couple times before. It's, I think it's just called an energy tank. It's the rectangle within the power-up icons, like a red center. That's effectively a full heal. It's not quite a full heal overall, but for a majority of the game, it might as well be. So make sure you grab one of those whenever you see it, because it also restores your health and chips. And in some of the later corridors, that is essential to getting through with high health. With that said, we're coming up on the boss fight, which I don't remember if I actively used the fireball on, but it's one I heavily recommend using it on just because of how this particular boss works. This is the Bombarder. It's a giant square robot that'll teleport across the screen, and whenever it fully fades in, it sends a barrage of missiles that home in on your location. That's all it does. The missiles themselves are kind of dangerous in the amount there are, because you don't exactly have a lot of invincibility frames in this game to begin with. But because any given projectile can also drop health and or chips, you might as well take them out just to see if you get any. In that regard, even just walking through, well, quote-unquote, walking through a barrage of missiles while shooting will probably work out with you getting some sort of power-up to restore whatever health you lose, especially in earlier instances like this where the damage is lower. Because at this point, between getting the red landers we've gotten on top of whatever score you've gotten, you probably have enough health where shoot-'em-up sections are a lot less stressful than they were even in Area 1. In fact, that's even the large reason I would recommend doing the majority of Area 2 before going into the main portion of Area 1 to do the optional corridors that way, as the power-ups you get along the way would help you take care of that specific boss fight we saw over there last time. And that's the optional corridor for this particular area done. And for clearing it, we get one of the best item types in the game that are relatively scarce because there's only a few of them, period. We are getting ourselves a defense up. It's a shield that raises your defense, just pretty straightforward. So notably, we're already right next to the plot corridor. Corridor 3 is through that blue pyramid to the left in the previous screen. But we don't know how the mechanism to open the door technically works yet, so I'm gonna venture through Area 3, get the items that are here anyway, and then find the hint for how we open it up. Along the way, though, we actually have one of my least favorite mini-boss types in the game because they're just really hard to dodge in my experience. Although I should note, I think whenever the alarm's going off in mini-bosses like this, you can just take the advantage of how long the blocks are taking to appear and leave the screen still. Not that I would ever do it, in fact, I don't think I ever have tried to, because I want whatever the power-up is from the boss fight, but worth noting all the same. So this urchin, I guess, is annoying because it's constantly homing on your location, bouncing around kind of unpredictably. And whenever you're trying to turn, be it doing a diagonal turn or just going from one cardinal direction to another, it's likely to bounce into you a couple times and just do a lot of damage. Thankfully, for beating that one, you get a defense up to begin with, but also there's a red lander right there to restore whatever health you lost. So for right now, let's actually start talking about the game's staff, like, directly. We talked about Compile's history a little bit last time, but I didn't talk about the direct staff. With that said, being an NES game, there's not exactly a lot of people listed in the staff. In fact, some of the people, we don't even know who they actually are. We only have their aliases. These are all from Moby Games directly, by the way. So the person listed as the programmer and effect designer is Takayuki Hirono. Their earliest credit is in Godzilla on the MSX as a sound programmer, which if they're not doing outright programming, like for the original Puyo-Puyo on NES and all that, they were effectively a sound design programmer, like on Xevious Far Drive Saga. Wait forever. The seal for number 3 will be removed. What are you doing here? Do not wait here. So, in order to open up corridor 3, we need to stand still in the room where that corridor is. Yeah, going back to Takayuki Hirono. They stay with Compile throughout a majority of the company's history, even being credited in the last few Puyo-Puyo games that company put out as a director or a programmer. But after Zanuck X Zanuck, which they were producer on, they were in nothing from 2001 to 2019, when they were credited in the Sega Genesis Minis credits as special thanks. They're in the Aleste collections as special thanks. But then when they did a new Aleste game in 2021 for the arcades, they were an advisor. But then when they did a Sorcerian remake of sorts, which was a Falcom game in like 2021, they were a game programmer again, so they're still in the industry. That right there that I just picked up is a bit of a unique weapon. That is the Enemy Eraser. That is a bit of a unique sub-weapon in that it doesn't use chips as ammo, it has its own separate ammo. In fact, now that we've gotten the first set, enemies, blocks, and anything else really will just randomly drop that. I'm holding on to those for a good while just to stock them up, but I do start using them a lot towards endgame, to the point where if you've noticed, there's a flashing light warning at the start of each of these videos. It's largely because of that sub-weapon, because it flashes the screen and kills basically every normal enemy in one shot. So, in order to open Corridor 3, like that text box said, we need to stand still for a good while here. About 20 seconds of just standing still the moment you enter the room, and the corridor itself will open, so now we can go wrap up our business here in Area 3. So the next person in the credits is listed as Password, so they're probably the engineer who designed the password system. That is Tadashi Ishimaru. They were a producer on Godzilla for the MSX, which I should know was later ported to the Game Boy. They were a programmer on Swing for the MSX, which was another Compile game. But after this, they were a special thanks person in Puyo-Puyo 2. They were a director for a Madao Monogatari game on the Game Gear in Japan, which I believe that is a dungeon crawling series I've only loosely interacted with over the years, seeing some footage here and there. It looks interesting, but I'm not a big fan of dungeon crawlers of that specific variety. After that, though, not too many other roles to talk about. They were a coordinator on Puyo Pop Fever as well as its console release. Their last listed role is as a director on the DS game Witch's Wish, which I had never heard of before today. By the looks, it is a relatively cute RPG where you do attacks by drawing on the bottom screen of the DS. It looks cute. I'm not the target demographic, but it's probably fine. Next up in the credits, we got Tomotoshi Nakamori, who was credited as the map maker. They were a programmer on Power Strike for the Master System, which is the Master System version of Aleste 1, I believe. They were on this. They did some programming for Cyberknight on the TurboGrafx, which is a game I've messed around with a little bit. They also did that on the technical direction side for the Super Nintendo version of that. But the game I probably know them the most for is Ys 4 Mask of the Sun for the Super Famicom. They were technical supporter on that. That is, to this day, probably my least favorite Ys game, having now finished up through Ys 8. It's just something about that Super Nintendo version. I don't like it. Otherwise, though, Cooperation and Puyo Pop Fever, which was their last credit, especially on the GameCube release. Next up in the credits after that is the graphics team, but we'll talk about that in a moment because it's time for us to fight the boss for Corridor 3, who is, again, one of the harder bosses in the game, and it's a boss we've technically already seen before. We fought a green one back in Part 2. It's time for us to fight a blue Optimon. The biggest change here, outside of just outright damage, is now the seaweed strains it sends out are much longer and also much faster. So it's very easy to get overwhelmed in this fight. On top of the fact that the seaweed still does ridiculous damage, this fight can go south really quickly. The thing to note, though, is that I said, like, earlier this part, that this game doesn't have a lot of invincibility frames for either you or opponents. But you can actually use that to your advantage in some cases. If you have a choice between getting hit by a single pellet from this thing instead of the seaweed, take it. If you're between a rock and a hard place, hit your head against the rock, if that makes sense. The fireball is ultimately your best choice for damage, though the repeller from my memory that we have is also not that bad. The big difference is whether or not you want it to be a little bit of a faster or a slower projectile, and I would rather have the slower projectile that does more damage in this instance, because at least the speed of a lot of boss fights is predictable enough where you can lead your shots pretty easily, not to worry too much, but at the same time, mileage may vary because some people have trouble tracking that many things in shoot-'em-ups. And with that, we got ourselves the next key, which I like to call the wave key, so we can now go access our next area. With that said, for beating this particular corridor, we don't get a notable upgrade. They just give you an energy tank, which, hey, I'm at 0 health. I'll take that. And since we're already right next to the exit, we're actually not going to speed our way out of Area 3. So we sped up earlier in the part. We're good to go now over to Area 4. So, the graphics team. This is the first instance of what I talked about earlier, where there are multiple people listed, but we actually only know the identity outright of one of them. The two people listed are Koji Teramoto and Yoriki. We don't know who Yoriki is. Mind you, a lot of the people in this game already use aliases as it is. Like Takayuki Hirono, the program and effect person, their name is listed as Gemini Hirono. Tadashi Ishimaru is listed as Wow Issei. Tomotoshi Nakamori is Pochi Nakamori. And tech we're about to talk about, Koji Teramoto in the credits is listed as Giannis Teramoto, so it's pretty much across the entire staff. And I get why, because a lot of the time, aliases were used at the time to prevent programmers and other staff from being poached by other companies. But it definitely also creates the effect of, we either don't know who these people are because they left the industry soon after, or if they stayed in the industry, people would not get the credit they deserved for years, if not decades after the fact. I'm really glad that nowadays, if nicknames are in credits, they're listed between or after the actual names of the people, or they're usually by, like, Kickstarters in the backer credits kind of deal. Just then, since we had over 300 chips, I bought myself a Hyper Laser upgrade. Now that that's level 2, it costs 6 per shot, but its damage is unchanged. The big difference is now you fire 2 lasers at either side of you upwards towards the top of the screen and shoot 'em up sections. Not too bad for coverage, but its damage is definitely lacking. So, Koji Teramoto. Their earliest credit is on Lunar Pool for the MSX as a title designer, but then they were a producer for Godzilla on the MSX. They're in the special thanks for Gardic. They're in the game design stuff as Giannis for the Sonic games on MSX and NES. They're in the credits for Cyberknight as a graphic designer. But then they did the logo for the original Puyo-Puyo as well as graphic design for the Genesis version and Super Nintendo version even the next year. But their last few roles are in Kirby's Avalanche for graphic design, Super Nazo Puyo as a graphic designer, Puyo-Puyo 2 as a graphic designer, and then after that, their last 2 roles are as special thanks sections for Compile, and a Madel Monogatari game on the SNES, and a Puyo-Puyo game on the SNES. With that, though, welcome to Area 4. It's a little bit of a trek from the bottom left in Area 3 to the top right in Area 4, but ultimately it is a pretty safe thing. Again, I'll appreciate the map actively updating as you do plot scenarios to actually give you direction on where to go compared to some other games on the system at least. So this area has, I think, the first instance of what this game likes to do in its latter half or so to quote-unquote extend the length of some of the areas. Red blocks like this cannot be destroyed, and they're going to start using them to effectively cut a lot of rooms into 2 separate halves you can only get to from one direction. So it's a lot more of a maze moving forward in some regards. Seal 4 cannot be removed. I think I goofed up when I sealed it. Ask for help from the round creature several times. And that's our hint for how we open up the plot corridor in this area. So next up in the credits for the game, we got the music team, which there are 2 people listed, Miyamo and Shunt, who are actually Masatomo Miyamoto and Takeshi Santo in specific. Masatomo Miyamoto in specific was the composer of that Godzilla game we've already mentioned a couple times. They were the composer for Gardic, the game this is a sequel/spiritual successor of. They composed Zanuck and Zanuck EX, Power Strike, so Alest 1 on the Master System, they were the VGM and sound effects person. Then it's a lot of stuff like Xevious Fardrat Saga, sound director, Alest 2, sound, Xevious Fardrat Saga on the TurboGrafx, sound director, and then their last role is in Cyberknight 1 for the TurboGrafx as the music composer. So in general, they were on Compile's sound teams more often than not. Already at corridor number 14. Thankfully, none of the optional corridors really require anything to really open the doors. The entire thing is that they are optional, so yay. Takeshi Santo on the sound team, though, they're one of the few people in the credits for the game that have actively stayed in the industry pretty regularly. Their first role was as a music composer for Gabelius Valley of Dune on the MSX, which they then did the Master System version of after that. They were in this, then Power Strike, so Celeste 1, Tombs and Treasure. Quite a few other games after that by the looks are all shoot-'em-ups. The next big game of note is the Jetsons Invasion of the Planet Pirates on the Super Nintendo, which they were a programmer on, clearly. No, their actual big game of note after that is Baroque on the Sega Saturn and PlayStation as a producer. Then Final Fantasy II, weirdly, the WonderSwan Color release in specific. They were a programmer. Riviera the Promised Land on the WonderSwan Color and Game Boy Advance, they were on the production team. Star Soldier on the PSP, they were a producer. Yggdra Union on the GBA, they were a producer. The next game I really care about they worked on, though, when they were an executive producer on Hexy's Force on the PSP. That's a fun little RPG. Dungeon Travelers 2, they were a producer. Utaware Mono, Mask of Deception, they were a producer. Same with Mask of Truth on the PS4. But their most recent credits are Dokapon Kingdom on the Switch as a producer and Fairy Fencer F Refrain Chord on the PS5 as a producer. So they are with Compile Heart actively nowadays. The next person in the credits after that is Sign-kun. We don't know who they are. They were credited as Effect Idea. We don't know who they are. Same with the next person in the credits, which actually starts the QA team effectively. The first person in the test play section is Midnight Commander Nui. We don't know who that is. After that is Koji Terimoto, who we've already talked about. He was on the graphics team. With that said, before we get into who's next, time for our next boss fight. This is a Clawbot. It's a giant spaceship that'll open up the claws in front of it and fire a laser out. Meanwhile, the main body is also firing out homing missiles that are pretty easy to destroy. The claws have their own separate HP bar, and when you drain that, they actually fall off the body, but when they do that, they're actively falling down on the screen, and you can still run into them and take damage when that's happening, so watch out. On top of that, once the claws get destroyed, the body will start firing the laser super rapidly, so you need to make sure you can dodge around it somehow. I'd recommend probably just dodging around it or taking a hit from a missile and clipping through it in the meanwhile. Fireball is probably your best friend here, as it will be basically throughout the rest of the campaign. I really like this subweapon a lot, if you cannot tell. Notably, this is a bit of an unusual corridor once again in that the reward for it isn't a direct weapon upgrade. Instead, it's just going to be a blue lander, which, hey, I'll take that all the same. But it definitely is a little bit unusual. The next person in the credits that's an actual person that we know the identity of is credited as Tanita. That is Takafumi Tanita in specific. They worked on Jagger 5 for the MSX, then this, Rune Master in the MSX, a less game on the Game Gear, Space Megaforce on the Super Nintendo, Power Strike 2, Puyo-Puyo 2, they were a director overall. Probably the most interesting game on the list, in my eyes, is that for the Sega CD version of Shadowrun, they were on the planning team. Though notably, they were also a producer on Aronoboken Maho no Jewel, which is a monster collecting, so effectively a Pokemon RPG set in the Puyo-Puyo universe. They were a producer on that, and then they were in the special thanks section on a Detective Conan game on the Game Boy Advance. Their last credit, similarly to someone else we saw earlier, is Witch's Wish on the DS as one of the programmers. So we're getting some power-ups in pretty fast sequence here. In fact, right here, we're even about to get a rapid fire-up. We hit level 2 with the multi-bullet and the cutter laser there. The cutter laser's level 2 upgrade makes it cost 10 chips per second, but it now does 4 times your current gun power, which is the main upgrade it got there, whereas the multi-bullets level 2 upgrade makes it cost 3 per second, but now the burst of energy it shoots out is larger in size. It does not increase in power, though, notably. Speaking of increase in firepower, though, once we finish off this blue urchin mini-boss, which again, I hate these things, we're actually going to spawn in another gun-up that is the second of those we found thus far, and there's only one more in the game. Your Buster in this game can get pretty powerful, don't get me wrong, but I do wish there was a single more offensive upgrade above that. I'll only sell one of these to you. Frankly, you should just go for the blue lander. The other stuff, there are enough power-ups to get to max anyway. But we need to remember what that hint said earlier. Any luck? In order to actually open up this corridor, we need to talk to this blue lander several times, which requires entering and re-entering the room. About 3 or 4 times total. I see you're trying very hard, so I will remove the seal for corridor number 4. So now we're good to go and finish off this area in that corridor. Up next in the credits for the test play is Takeshi Santo again, so one of the composers was also a QA tester, we've already talked about them. But after that is Pal, who is Pal Kitatani. They worked on this, Thexter, they were special thanks, Zanuck, their thanks, and Gardic, their special thanks. So I'm going to guess someone who was largely in the office side of things that was helping out, or maybe a friend of someone else on the team that they had help out with some things in minor ways. And after that, there actually is another role in the test player section, etc. So they probably didn't even credit all the people who were test players. After that, though, is the game's director, who is Mu Nitani, who is actually Matsumitsu Nitani. They worked on a lot of the same games as the rest of this team. Load Runner, Lunar Pool, Godzilla MSX, Zanuck and Zanuck EX, Jagger 5, Rune Master, Blazing Lasers, Gun Knack, GG Alest, basically the entire Alest series, Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, probably Kirby's Avalanche if I scroll up high enough. If they were on the Puyo-Puyo team a lot as executive producer, in fact, they just tended to be an executive producer past like 89 by the looks. They do have some more recent credits, but like after Zanuck X Zanuck, so after the closing of Compile, effectively, it's like Pochi and Nya in arcade, the PS2 version of it. Then they jump forward to 2016 with Nyoki Nyoki Tabidachi Hen on the 3DS, which I think is a Puyo-Puyo-like, so a falling puzzle kind of game, and then their last credit to date is in the Alest collection on the Switch. And that technically finishes the main game staff, but there's still a few things related to that we're going to talk about across the next part or so. For now, let's talk about the boss of Corridor 4. This relatively impressive looking sprite is called a Terramute. It's a dragon that teleports in, breathes a couple of arcs of fireballs, teleports out, then does the same somewhere else. The fire doesn't even do a lot of damage, so if you just get right in its face and fire fireballs, this thing will die pretty quickly. Honestly, I think the Clawbot is technically a harder boss fight. Mind you, the fact I have as much health as I do now probably helps with that. Once it dies, we're once again going to be awarded with a new key, in this case, the square key, if memory serves. And once we actually leave the corridor, the other item we get is another multi-bullet, which maxes that particular sub-weapon out at level 3. The final form of the multi-bullet takes 10 chips per second. Its damage is still whatever your current gun power is, but the burst of energy it fires out is now very large and even very fast. It's not too bad, but I don't use it a lot. I tend to only really stick with a couple of sub-weapons. There's basically no unuseful sub-weapons for certain playstyles in here, but for my taste, I prefer the higher power stuff in general. So with that, we're now good to leave Area 4 and head over towards Area 5. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in Part 4, we're gonna take care of Area 5 and probably even a little bit of Area 6 if memory serves before seeing what else we can get it for power-ups along the way. See you guys then.